Sony Pictures Animation has a villain problem, but in the best way possible. In an era where some studios smooth their antagonists into misunderstood obstacles, and others bounce between comedy and menace without committing, Sony keeps pulling off something weirdly rare: villains that stick. Not just loud, not just stylish. Memorable, specific, sometimes totally unhinged, and always built to change the temperature of the story. So what is Sony doing differently? Why do their animated villains keep landing in a way that feels sharper than most of the competition? Let's start with the villain who proves Sony's whole philosophy in one arc. The Spot, the joke that turns into a nightmare. He starts as a joke, a walking, talking ink blot with the energy of a guy who got kicked out of a community theater production and decided to become a supervillain anyway. When we first meet the Spot, he's treated like comic relief. Miles barely takes him seriously. The fight feels like a warm-up, like the movie is winking at you and saying, "Relax, this isn't the real threat." And you buy it, because he's framed that way on purpose. But Sony isn't doing a villain of the week, they're doing a rise. Here's the factual engine under the comedy. The Spot is an Alchemax scientist whose body gets infused with portal-like holes during the events tied to the Collider's destruction, and he blames Miles for what happened to him. And in Across the Spider-Verse, the story makes his "nobody takes me seriously" problem a real personal wound, not a gag. He's not ignored because he's harmless. He's ignored because he's inconvenient. He's a leftover, a footnote, a mistake the narrative tried to forget. And that's why his evolution works. It's emotional before it's cosmic. The more he opens holes, literal portals, the more he becomes the thing he feels inside. Emptiness with an ego. His power growth mirrors his identity collapse. The humor drains out. The shape language gets sharper. He stops sounding like a dork doing bits and starts sounding like someone who has decided the universe owes him meaning. Sony makes the audience complicit in that transformation too. At first, you laugh with Miles. Then the movie flips the perspective, and suddenly you're watching a character you dismissed become a genuine threat. Not because he found a bigger laser, but because he found a bigger purpose. And this isn't accidental. The filmmakers have openly talked about how unlikely the Spot seemed as the centerpiece villain. In a Collider interview, Phil Lord and Chris Miller describe Avi Arad pitching the Spot, and their initial reaction being basically, "That's the dorkiest option possible," before they realize the arc potential. That matters, because it confirms what you feel watching the movie. The dorkiness is not a flaw, it's the point. It's the seed. Even the design supports that narrative. The Spot is intentionally introduced with a look that evokes an unfinished sketch, and the design evolves as he becomes more confident and dangerous. So the villain's escalation isn't just new form equals stronger, it's new form equals new identity. And here's the bigger reason he lands. The Spot isn't just threatening Miles physically, he threatens the story Miles is trying to live in. Miles's whole fight in Across is about rejecting the idea that his life is a pre-written script, a set of canon rules he has to obey. The Spot is the dark mirror of that. He's a character who was told he doesn't matter, so he decides he'll matter through destruction. One is reaching for freedom, the other is reaching for proof. Sony lets that chase infect the audience. You walk in expecting a minor villain, and you walk out thinking about the guy who started as a punchline because he changed the rhythm of the film. That's a strong villain, someone who alters the air in the room. But Sony didn't start with the Spot. They were already building this villain blueprint years earlier, by pairing two antagonists with completely different kinds of pressure. Into the Spider-Verse. Two villains, two types of fear. Let's talk about the first image a lot of people remember from Into the Spider-Verse. A giant black mass with a tiny head, stomping forward like a human wrecking ball, Kingpin. And what's brilliant is that his design is almost absurd, but the movie never plays him as a joke. He's not big guy scary. He's big guy inevitable. His motive is simple and horrifying. He builds the Collider because he wants to access parallel universes to bring back versions of his wife and son, Vanessa and Richard, after losing them. And the story doesn't ask you to forgive him for that grief. It doesn't soften him into a misunderstood dad. It turns grief into a weapon. Denial so heavy, it crushes everything around it. Kingpin's presence is physical and narrative. When he enters a scene, it tightens. The room feels smaller. The air feels thicker. He doesn't need cackling villain speeches. His body is the monologue. And then Sony does something smart. They don't rely on one flavor of threat. Because Olivia Octavius is the opposite energy. When Miles and Peter go to Alchemax, they expect science lab seriousness. And they get this chaotic, twitchy, upbeat menace who introduces herself like she's in a totally different movie. She's the head scientist at Alchemax and the one building the collider under Kingpin's orders. This universe's Dr. Octopus. Kingpin is force. Liv is unpredictability. Kingpin makes you fear consequence. Liv makes you fear surprise. And by pairing them, Sony keeps the villain side momentum fresh. Every time the movie risks settling into one tone, the villain lineup yanks it sideways. Brutal inevitability, then chaotic experimentation, then brutal again. That's why the mix works. In modern animation, a lot of villain problems come from monotone threat. If the antagonist feels like the same emotional note for 90 minutes, you stop feeling tension. Spider-Verse avoids that. It's the same reason people praise the 1-2 punch of different threat styles in films like Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, where dread and comedy pressure coexist without canceling each other out. Different studio, same principle. Varied villain energy keeps you alert. And here's the part Sony really trusts the audience with. Neither Kingpin nor Liv spend the whole film explaining themselves. The movie shows you who they are through action, through rhythm, through the way they change everyone's behavior around them. A lot of animated films are terrified of letting villains just be dangerous. Spider-Verse isn't. It's proof that animated villains don't need apologies. They need purpose and presence. Now, Spider-Verse is a multiverse story. High stakes demand sharp antagonists. Fine. But Sony proves this isn't a one-off. Because they pull off a killer villain even when the movie is about something as inherently goofy as sentient food animals. Chester 5. Corporate evil with a TED Talk smile. Chester V walks in like a savior. He's polished, inspirational, namaste, tech mogul charisma. Basically a walking keynote speech. In Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs 2, he's the CEO of LiveCorp and Flint Lockwood's childhood idol. And he offers Flint a dream job. And that's what makes him a great villain. He doesn't enter with fangs out. He enters with a handshake. Chester's villainy is emotional manipulation wearing a clean suit. Factually, the plot turns on this. Chester tells Flint the FLDSMDFR is still active, sends him back to Swallow Falls under the pretense of shutting it down, and later reveals the BSUS is actually a reprogramming device. Chester takes control of the machine and starts capturing the foodimals to use them as ingredients for LiveCorp's food bars. That's not evil sorcerer. That's evil branding. A predator in a corporate hoodie. And Chester's personality is built around performance. Every scene is a pitch. Every smile feels rehearsed. He's constantly staging himself as the smartest, nicest guy in the room, while quietly separating Flint from his friends and steering him into dependence. Then there's the way he treats Barb, his orangutan assistant. Chester's cruelty shows up in the small humiliations, treating her like property, disrespecting her intelligence, talking down to her like she's a tool, not a person. And eventually, Barb turns on him because she's had enough. That dynamic is important because it exposes Chester's core, control. Not just control of technology, control of people, control of credit, control of the narrative of who deserves praise. Kingpin controls through brute force. The Spot controls through chaos and escalation. Chester controls through polish. And kids might not label it emotional manipulation, but they feel it. They feel the wrongness, the smoothness that doesn't match reality, the smile that doesn't warm the room. It chills it. That's why Chester V sticks. He's funny, yes, but he's also recognizable. a villain archetype pulled from real life, the boss who acts like a friend until you're useful. And Sony makes a key choice. Chester doesn't get redeemed. He doesn't learn. He doubles down. He stays who he is until the story crushes him with consequences. That commitment is what gives him bite. Now, what if your villain isn't a genius, or a tyrant, or a multiverse anomaly? What if your villain is just a local legend who can't stand being outshined? Tank Evans, the perfect foil villain. In Surf's Up, Tank Evans isn't trying to destroy the world. He's trying to stay on top of it. He's the arrogant champion of the Big Z Memorial Surf-Off, winning it 9 times since it began after Big Z was presumed dead. Tank's villainy is ego as lifestyle. He needs the spotlight like oxygen. He talks like the camera is always rolling because, for him, it basically is. And the movie uses Tank perfectly. Not as a final boss of evil, but as a test. Cody is obsessed with what surfing means because he idolizes Big Z as a symbol of purity and purpose. Tank represents the opposite: spectacle without soul, winning without reverence, fame without depth. That's why the rivalry has weight. It isn't just good guy versus jerk. It's a clash of values, the spirit of the sport versus the performance of the sport. And the twist that Big Z is alive and ends up training Cody reframes everything. Cody grows by unlearning the fame-chasing mindset Tank embodies. Tank doesn't need a secret tragic backstory to be effective. He's a warning sign. What happens when the image matters more than the thing itself? And that's another Sony villain win. They understand that sometimes the best antagonist isn't pure evil. Sometimes it's the person who forces the hero to evolve by embodying the path the hero is tempted to take. Tank is there to be beaten, yes, but more importantly, he's there to be outgrown. The pattern: why Sony villains stick. So what's the through line? Sony's best villains tend to share a few traits. They're built from a clear emotional engine: Spot's irrelevance, Kingpin's denial, Chester's control, Tank's ego. They have a strong presence language, design, animation rhythm, and scene gravity that changes the film when they enter. They aren't afraid of consequences. These villains don't float through the plot as harmless obstacles. The story lets them scar the narrative. Even when Sony does sympathetic or charming, they don't soften the villain into nothing. They let the villain's choices mean something. And that's where comparisons get interesting. Disney has absolutely made iconic villains historically, and even now, they sometimes aim for classic villain energy again, like positioning Magnifico as the Wish Keeper in Rosas, who turns to forbidden magic to maintain control. But in a lot of modern mainstream animation, there's a tendency to over-explain antagonists to the point where menace gets diluted. Sony's edge is that they often trust the audience to connect the dots, because the second you explain evil into a spreadsheet, you drain it of mystery. And mystery is what makes villains unforgettable. So here's the final truth. Either let a villain live their evil with conviction, or commit fully to their tragedy and make the descent inevitable. But if you try to do both halfway, you end up with neither. And if you've noticed that twist villains haven't been hitting the same lately, and why surprise bad guy writing keeps failing, then you'll want the next video, because the twist villain dilemma has a fix, if studios are brave enough to use it.